Hello and welcome to COVIDCon. My name is Bobby Ghosh. I'm a columnist for Bloomberg and a member of the editorial board. In this session, we're going to discuss the impact of the pandemic on social and political protest movements around the world. I'm delighted to be joined by three very well-known activists from around the world, starting with Frances Hui from Hong Kong. She's an activist, social activist, both in Hong Kong and in Boston. You may remember her from her recent column entitled I'm from Hong Kong, Not China, which was read all over the world. From Khartoum, we have Rania Aziz, who is a Sudanese activist. She was one of the leaders of the women-led protest movement that brought down the Sudanese dictator last year. And she now works with government and social groups to try and promote women's participation in the transitional civilian-led government in Sudan. And then finally, from Harare, we have Evan Mawarire, who's internationally famous for his This Flag citizens movement in Zimbabwe. He's been jailed and charged with treason several times by the Zimbabwean government for mobilizing millions of people into demanding more justice and an end to corruption in Zimbabwe. I'm delighted that all three of you can join, and I'm looking very much forward to this conversation. I'm going to start with asking each of you to answer this question. When it became clear that there was going to be a pandemic and that much of the world, certainly your world, was going to go into a lockdown, tell me about what your social or political movement began to do to prepare for it, to make sure that your movement retained its following, its momentum, its organization. Frances, why don't we start with you?
Of course. So the COVID-19 actually hits Hong Kong around January. So as we would expect, like, the chief executive, Carrie Lam, actually did a very bad job in terms of how she responded to the virus. So, but because most of us have learned our lesson and suffered from the SARS in 2003, a lot of the people, especially the civil society, contribute to make the situation better. I would say the government actually did barely any good on, fixing the problem. So, for instance, when there was a shortage of surgical masks, Carrie Lam could actually, activate some of the resources to produce more masks, but she didn't. So, instead of relying and waiting for the government to act, a lot of the political organization and different people, either they source the mask in other places or even produce their own mask and distribute it to the communities. So I think the outbreak actually gave us chances, especially those who are, social activists or participants of the movement in Hong Kong, and gave us, opportunities to continue the spirit of the movement and, keep the momentum rolling in different ways, even though we're brought down from the streets and we couldn't, protest on the streets together.
Right. Rania, in Sudan, the movement is in a different place in its evolution. You've already brought down a dictator. You have a transitional government, but there are still, I'm sure, concerns about maintaining a momentum. Tell me how you responded to the pandemic.
Okay. Well, to start with, as you mentioned, we're no longer fighting an authoritarian regime. We are in a very different stage in our activism. The activism scene has changed completely in Sudan. We, after 30 years of different struggle, it took different shapes, from armed struggle to peaceful and non-violent struggle. We finally toppled the regime. And this April marks our first revolution anniversary. This being said, the activism scene has changed completely, so we are collaborating with the government this time. The first reaction, it hit us a little bit later. The world started suffering from the pandemic in January onward. It hit us in Sudan in March, first week of March. The first reaction, there were like many conversations around different challenges that we are faced with and how can we collaborate with the government in these challenges. Challenges around raising awareness all around Khartoum, challenges around the economic situation, and not only the economic situation from the government support in terms of how is the government responding and what our financial abilities and limitations are. There are more than 60% of the workforce are in the informal sector. So there were discussions around how can we sustain living in case of a total lockdown, what kind of financial aid is needed. That was mainly the first reaction, discussions around the challenges we are faced with.
Okay. Ivan, your movement is in some ways older than either the Hong Kong movement or the one in Sudan. You've been doing this for many, many years. But I assume you've never confronted a crisis of this nature before. Tell me a little bit about how you responded when you first heard that the lockdown was coming.
You know, it's obviously a very, very different challenge that we're facing. Although I must say, in some ways, our movement has been involved in things that are similar. You see, in parts of Africa, particularly in Zimbabwe, we've had challenges that look like COVID in terms of how they affect us and things like that. So, for example, we've had massive cholera outbreaks, we've had massive typhoid outbreaks, and we've also had massive economic collapses over the last couple of years. So in terms of us responding, in terms of what we do, we felt like we had a very little bit of a dress rehearsal. The only difference being that this particular challenge in its nature, I think, has caught the entire world by surprise. So where we would normally call for help as a nation are places that themselves are under siege. And the biggest challenge that we faced over the years with cholera, with typhoid, and now with the COVID-19 virus is how inept our government has been over the years, the clumsiness, the slowness to react, the slowness to be serious about something that is actually killing people or something that is putting people at risk. So in terms of how we positioned ourselves once the virus began its move into Africa, and much of Africa, much of the world, I think we only began to make moves in early March. So part of what we began to do immediately was to start social messaging about what people should be doing to keep themselves safe, but also quickly what governments should be doing to ensure the safety of citizens. And just like Rania is also mentioning, one of the big challenges that we face in Zimbabwe is that we have a huge unemployment numbers. Zimbabwe runs between 90 and 95% unemployment. We have run a completely informal sector. So if we have a lockdown, the biggest questions are, whilst we are observing lockdowns and isolation, what do people do that eat on a daily basis what they earn on that particular day? So we've moved into those two positions where we are running awareness about how citizens can keep themselves safe, because government wasn't doing it. So we were first mover. We were the first ones to begin to run messaging on that. And then immediately we began to try to prod and nudge government to move quicker to in terms of ensuring citizens that they were going to be active as this virus was spreading.
Okay. So is there any concern from all three of you that we've seen in some parts of the world, Hungary most prominently, but also in other parts of the world, that governments, authoritarian governments or totalitarian governments, or even just populist governments, are taking advantage of the pandemic to attack civil society and to expand the government's control over the country, over society, using tools supposedly to keep their communities healthy and safe, but that can also be used to spy on people and can be used as instruments of oppression. Do you have concerns with each of your movements that all the good work that you've done over the last few years might be undone if your government takes these kinds of actions and basically creates a new reality, so that at the end of this period, let's hope it's quick, when we are ready to come back, when you are ready to come back into the streets or into activism as you did it before, that you might find that the space has been occupied or is no longer available. Francis, are you seeing any such things? Are you seeing the Hong Kong government doing things like that? Is this a concern for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for us, there is a mixed feelings because right now the government is taking advantage of this window of time to make arrests, and kidnapping are actually happening. Although we can do like fact checking on those incidents, but we are seeing increased cases of people missing, and then people are getting arrested. But on the other side of the of the situation, I think on the level of social activism, the coronavirus is actually for us it gives a gain for us because at the time when coronavirus hit Hong Kong, we were at the stage where people are feeling very exhausted and frustrated because the movement had been going on for like 6 months at that time, and protests happened really frequently, almost on daily basis in a very intense level. And so a lot of people feel very exhausted and not sure like what we can do to proceed. And so we're kind of stuck at the bottleneck, and uncertainties are everywhere. So when the COVID-19 came, it actually, I don't want to phrase it like we have been waiting for this virus, but it gave us a time for everyone to take a break and think about what we can do in the future. And it allowed us to have time to study and utilize the knowledge in the future. And some people will use it to maybe for their personal health, because the protest had created a huge damage to some to people's mental health, and so everyone just utilized that time to do what they want with the movement. And so right now I'm absolutely confident that people are actually going to come back. I don't think people are going to forget anything, or I think the anger is still here. It's still unsettled, and the painfulness are still with everyone. So I'm at least at this point, I'm quite positive that people is waiting. They have been waiting to bring the anger back to the streets, and they're waiting for this.
That's very interesting. Can I stay with you for a second and ask you a follow up there? So towards the end of last year, the economic impact of the Hong Kong protests were beginning to get felt. The tourism numbers were down, and at least the government was beginning to put out this message that this protest movement is costing us economically. Now, when we come out of this pandemic, it's already clear that all over the world there's going to be an enormous economic cost to be paid. So all of our societies will be struggling economically at the end of this crisis. That being the case, are you concerned in any way that Hong Kong society, and I don't mean people participating in movement, but Hong Kong society at large, will it have the same tolerance for the movement? Will it support your movement as much as it did before? Or are you worried that people will say, listen, this is a hard time economically, you guys should stop protesting, we need to get back to work, we need to fix our economy, we can't afford the distraction of political movements right now?
I mean, those people who only care about the economy is always going to be there. They're already there when we had the movement before the pandemic. So I think this coronavirus actually even made people who are like pro-Beijing or pro-government feeling, having angry about how the government responded to the pandemic, in terms of, the shortage of masks and how they responded to the pandemic at first when they were not shutting down the border to China. And there are huge backlash basically against the government about how they responded to the whole situation. And still right now, a lot of people, even though work has resumed, school has resumed, but people are still, people who were on the other side actually stood on actually is standing on our side right now. So I think for people who only care about, benefits and profits, or, economy, they will always stay the same sometimes. So I don't think we should care that much about those people. And at this moment of time, people are just going to stand together and face this problem together. So, yeah.
Rania, there's no fear, is there, of the military in Sudan taking advantage of this moment to reclaim power? Are you confident in the civilian-led government's ability to ride out this crisis?
Well, the risk of the military being in the picture and part of this power-sharing deal will remain a valid risk all through the transitional period. But on the government side, this time is the first time we face a crisis on a transparent note. Our health system is very fragile after 30 years of corruption and minimal budget going towards health sector or education. 90% of the budget was going towards the military and security forces. So, but this time the way the government our government, transitional government, is handling this file is very transparent. For the first time, we do have a transparent health minister giving us a daily brief about the situation, the conditions, our financial abilities, our limitations, and our readiness to face the pandemic. It's amazing, but it's not one thing we're celebrating. It's one thing that we've been fighting to have. Access to the right information and accurate information is a right, it's not a privilege. On the movement side, there's a lot of work happening in collaboration with the government. Most of the civil society, social movements, charity groups, individual volunteers, resistance committees are all coming together and forming different emergency rooms to respond to the crisis, to the pandemic, in collaboration with the health ministry. There is a lot of on-ground work happening, a lot of collaboration. There is awareness campaigns. Even we don't have census. This is one of the biggest challenges. So some of the neighborhood committees are working on the neighborhood level, trying to list and count families, list and count those who will be in need for financial aid in case of a total lockdown. A lot of creativity happening on the streets. There is a gravity, production of songs, short films. So there is a lot of huge level of collaboration between the government and social movements and civil society.
Evan, in Zimbabwe, you've worked very hard over many years to create momentum. And over the last couple of years, I feel, at least observing from outside, that you've reached almost like a critical mass, if it's fair to say that. Are you concerned in any way that people being locked down will force you to take some steps back?
I mean, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. The nature of the government in Zimbabwe is that they, because of their failures in terms of governance, resource management, and injustice, just in the last 2 years alone, because of those failures, I think the desire in the ordinary citizen to press for better governance, to press for justice, and to press for the eradication of corruption, it was very high and still is very high. And so the advent of this virus is kind of a two-way track. There's a give and take here for us. And let me explain that. I think there is an opportunity to confirm once again the extent to which social services in this country have been completely destroyed through mismanagement and misgovernance by the current government, which was the same government under Robert Mugabe before he was deposed and before he died. So it has. I mean, and everybody knew how bad things were, but this virus has really laid it bare how exposed we are, how literally we do not have a health delivery system at all. So that's one side of it, in that it has given us, it's kind of fed, I think, the appetite to demand better, from the citizens to government. But on the other hand, the need to lock down nations and to control the movement of people has meant that government has an opportunity to put in place certain instruments that they will keep. even after this virus is over. Now, what we have done over the last couple of years, we have thrived in being able to mobilize people to get on the street because our constitution gives us the freedom and the right to protest and the right to gather. But with this new law, they can now arrest anyone and claim that you have interrupted essential services and claim that you have issued statements that are prejudicial to the state. And this is now whether you are inside or outside Zimbabwe. So this is a really, really a big challenge for us. This is a blow, if I can put it that way, to the ways in which we have been able to mobilize before, going forward. This new law will have to be tested at some point. Because it is unconstitutional anyway.
So a final question before we go to the audience to see what they'd like to ask you. You flicked at this earlier, Evan, when you pointed out that the rest of the world, the places to which you would normally turn for help, for assistance, or for pressure to be put on your government, all of those countries, Europe, the United States, Britain, are themselves now highly distracted in dealing with the pandemic. How concerned are you if this goes on for several months, heaven forbid? How concerned are you that your movement will be forgotten, lost, and that people that ought to be paying attention, putting pressure on your government, won't be doing that?
Look, there definitely is a big concern for that. This says, this is a gift for our authoritarian regime here. As you've rightly said, the global distraction by nations or bodies or organizations that would normally call out injustice in Zimbabwe. So this is going to be a big challenge for us going forward. I think that the government feels a sense of relief. And senses that maybe we have been abandoned. But then we go back again to the foundings of this flag when we started. One of our catchphrases there was, "We are the people that we have been waiting for." And I think we have to drive hard on the messaging that nobody fights for Zimbabwe better or more than a Zimbabwean. Zimbabweans should always be the first ones, first responders when Zimbabwe needs them, when we have issues on the ground. So this is going to be, the litmus test for us as Zimbabweans. Can we stand for our nation? Can we stand for the things that concern us if we didn't have international support, or if international support took a back seat? And it's either going to make or break the different social movements and the different initiatives in Zimbabwe that have been holding government to account. Can we stand on our own? And I think that this is going to force us to have to do that.
Rania, what is the view from Khartoum?
I absolutely agree with Evan. We should not be relying entirely on foreign support to move movements forward or to put pressure on government. There's a lot of internal work. It's solely internal. I think there is a silver lining for movements amid this crisis. There is a lot that movements can do now and plant a seed and see it growing. It's a time for movements, for example, to work on recruitment, to work on building trust and building bonds within their own.
And you can do that from home when you're locked down?
You can do that digitally. I mean, there is a lot of, you can use your Facebook page, your online resources and tools to start rebranding the movement. There's a lot that you can do. And this takes me, besides that you can work from home, this takes me back to two incidents. Back in 2013 in Sudan, there was a big flood in the country and the government failed miserably in responding to this flood. And immediately social movement stepped in and called for an initiative called Nafir. Most of the social movement with a political agenda, civil society, volunteers, people from different religious background or political beliefs started joining this initiative to respond to the crisis. And it was an amazing response. There were their houses got destroyed. Some people were locked in areas with no access to food or no access to health services or no one to rescue them. And this response, it was a purely volunteers initiative, managed to basically do the government role. That was in July, August 2013. 13. The byproduct of this, there was a huge level of trust and strength came back to us. We started believing in ourselves. We started seeing where the strength really lies. 1 month after, in September 2013, a big uprising happened. The government managed to contain it, but people came together. There was a great sense of solidarity and sense of community work. It gave us this trust and strength. And September 2013 is a milestone in the Sudanese struggle against the Bashir regime.
That's very interesting. Francis, let me end with you before we go to the audience. Are you seeing in your movement in Hong Kong, are you seeing efforts to use digital and social tools to expand the movement, to improve recruiting, to keep people motivated?
Absolutely. I think not only in Hong Kong, in a lot of places, we have moved things to home and stay home and do things remotely. So as I said, I don't think the momentum is going to stop. I don't think the pandemic is going to stop anyone from going to the streets in the future. So as I said, people are going to come back. But one of the things I would want to highlight is that a very famous model of the Hong Kong movement is to be water, which means all of our plans.
Bruce Lee,
yeah, a lot of our plans has to be, we has to keep it as flexible as possible. And so a lot of people would ask, like, has the movement in Hong Kong has already ended? Is that already died out? I would argue that the movement hasn't ended. We are adapting to the environment and situation, which in this case is a pandemic. And we are looking at how we can practice civil disobedience and participate in politics without having any social contact and direct protest with other people.
Thank you, all three of you, for those very enlightening comments. We're now going to take questions from the audience. And so just stand by. Evan, I know we're going to lose you. But we look forward to questions from the audience. If you want to ask questions from our panelists, or if you have some thoughts you want to suggest, this is your chance. And thank you very much, all of you who've already sent in questions. We're going to try to get through as many of them as we can in the short time available. We're sorry to have lost Pastor Evander. He had another engagement that he couldn't get out of. But I'm delighted that Rania and Francis are both still here with us. Francis, the first question goes to you. It comes from Rick. And he asks, I'm paraphrasing here, has the pro-China faction of the Hong Kong government ignored international demands to improve its dealing with the COVID-19 crisis? As a Hong Kong resident, do you feel that the government could and should have done more? I know you alluded to this in our conversation at the beginning, but perhaps you could talk a little more about that.
Yeah, I think at the beginning when the COVID-19 hits Hong Kong, right away we asked is to close the border of Hong Kong to China, where the virus was rooted from. And at that time, people from China flooded into Hong Kong trying to find a place to stay because obviously it's too risky for them to stay in China. And at that time, all we were asking is to close the border, and the government didn't respond to us. Not until the early February that KRLM closes down a few of the border checkpoints. But again, the border is still partially open. And although the high-speed rail links are, suspended, there were still a lot of people who flooded in. And at the same time, there were a lot of supplies like health supplies shortage. There are videos of like older people lining up every day looking for surgical masks, and some would head home with like nothing on their hands. And I remember seeing news videos of like elderly people who are obviously the most vulnerable people in front of the virus. They have to reuse their masks because they have limited mask supplies. And that was the time when different local companies or organizations were trying to invest and produce more masks on their own and source the mask overseas to bring them back to the communities. So as I said before, KRLM could have activated some of the resources to generate more masks and control the shortage by, making sure companies are not increasing prices but she didn't do it. So there are a lot of aspects. We can see that the Carrie Lam is totally ignoring the health of the Hong Kong people and just trying to make the Chinese government as happy as possible, and she's just ignoring the health of the general public.
Yeah. So the next question, I'm gonna take questions from Tommy as well as John, who are sort of asking something quite similar. And this is a question for both of you, but maybe Rania, you can start. The question is, in a situation where people are unable to gather, and so public demonstrations are out of question, what are the other forms of protest or other forms of pressure that movements can bring onto governments? I mean, I'm reminded of Professor Gene Sharp's thesis that there are 198 different ways of putting pressure on government. But in this particular time of social distancing, of lockdowns, of isolations, what are some of the strategies that you think would work? Rania, why don't you start?
Yes, sure. I would think one of the strategies that movements can focus on right now is building a platform, a digital platform, start mobilizing via the available resources online. And one important thing is exposing governments. So far, none of the authoritarian regimes' governments are giving accurate data or sharing with the public all the information that they need to know. So they can work around exposing the government and more awareness about our rights. It's not health or privacy, it's both.
Francis, what's happening in Hong Kong?
I agree with what Rania said. And on top of that, I think now we're seeing a lot of political activists. They're trying to bring, the conversation about, social issues to digital platforms, including like YouTube, Facebook, Instagram. We now have a lot of like live stream function on different social media platform, and so it makes it easier compared to the time when we have SARS in 2003, which we could bring the conversation up there, and we can have like Q&A, like what we're doing right now. So I think there are a lot of ways that we can keep the momentum going, and also keep remembering, the leftover from the previous movement, and keep discussing about certain issues. And then after the pandemic passed, it's the time for us to come back. That's in my opinion.
So both of you have talked about building social platforms, social media platforms using digital tools. So that's a question that raises a question that Chloe asks, and she says, to what degree does the access to internet connectivity contribute to the longevity of a protest movement? Or another way to look at it is the lack of Wi-Fi access detrimental to sustaining a movement? Now, in a place like Hong Kong, where Wi-Fi is readily available, it's a very connected place, can you imagine a situation where you'd have to sustain a movement without that kind of access?
To be frank, I can't imagine, because a lot of times we have discussions about what strategies we want to use in the protest. Those kind of conversations happen online. We have our own forum for Hong Kong people, and most of the people also use the chat app Telegram, which we don't have to disclose our identity. We don't have to use our true name to talk and on the app. So I think it is really difficult for us to just by communication or practicing outreach in general, because we also produce some promotional materials on social media, including Facebook, Instagram, about like telling people outside of Hong Kong about what is happening in Hong Kong every day. And so it is going to be very difficult, but I'm sure there are ways that we can figure out I know there are, online chat that is being used through Bluetooth. That could be one of the ways where people can, communicate, but it's going to be very difficult, I would say.
Right. Rania, what is the experience from Sudan, where internet penetration is not as deep, let's say, as Hong Kong?
I think it's the same. It will be really difficult and hard to sustain a lot of on-the-ground work if it's not on social media, given the lockdown. The situation in Sudan is a little bit different, as I have mentioned, because most of the social movements and most of the activism entirely is collaborating with the government.
Yeah.
So it's different, but I can see it's a little bit hard for movement to sustain their work given the current situation. But keep the social media pressure and word of mouth is also going to be out there. There is a hashtag in Zimbabwe. I don't know what it's called exactly, but it talks about what after COVID. So it keeps the momentum and it keeps people engaged and thinking of what will they do after COVID-19.
Right. So we have a question from Maury, which is a really interesting question. She says, in my country, or he or she says, in my country, and I don't know what the country is, COVID-19 is dramatically increasing the support for the police, for the government, and for authority in general. People are scared, and they're strongly in favor of surveillance or enforcement mechanisms, and they seem to be welcoming increased policing. And in some cases are even turning on each other. Now, the question then is of setting precedents that after the crisis is over will linger and might be used by governments going forward. Are you seeing, Francis, in Hong Kong or in mainland China, the same acceptance in the face of a crisis of greater government interference?
I think it is a different situation in Hong Kong because people have lost trust on the Hong Kong police after the 6 months of protest. And now the government is using the police to conduct arrests on people who participated in the protest, even after all the protests have passed for so long, and we're now in the midst of the coronavirus. They're still, practicing crackdown and trying to arrest people who participate. So there are still, I think the trust it's going to be very difficult to be regained. People are still terrorized by the Hong Kong police, basically. So I don't see that the Hong Kong police is gaining more trust back because of this virus, and so I think it is more about the threats that because the Hong Kong government is now using this time to conduct more investigation, more arrest, and also maybe trying to have import more equipment for the police. So I think that's more of a concerning part.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Bring it to us. Yeah.
And Rania, in Sudan or more generally in the Arab world or in Africa, are you seeing a change in people's attitudes? Are people now more tolerant of strong government interference in their lives or surveillance because of this crisis?
Well, if I look at Sudan, we don't know yet. So far we have 29 cases confirmed, and the country is going to go in a total lockdown as of Saturday. Security forces and the police will be in charge and making sure that no one is on the street. We don't know. This is a major concern now. How would the security forces would handle this? So far, we don't have any clarity on the security sector reforms within the transition and after the toppling of the previous regime. There are very minor structural reforms happened within the security sector. but we don't have a full visibility on what reforms are happening there. Did they change the laws? And it's the same tool and it's the same police that were arresting people and torturing people few months back. It's a valid concern. We don't know how would they handle it.
Right. And of course, in Sudan, and in Sudan, you have a case of the former Janjaweed who are essentially terrorizing Darfur, are now trying to use this opportunity to clean up their image a little bit.
Absolutely. They will try to gain legitimacy and they will try to gain some ground now.
Okay. All right. The next question comes from Syria. A person called Dara who says that they are a Syrian activist. Actually, they're based in Beirut. Many people's movements had already begun to struggle before the COVID-19 outbreak, such as in Lebanon, because of the financial crisis, in Syria due to the armed conflict. What advice do you have for people's movements that have reached a financial and physical and mental limits? Rania, would you like to try that first?
Yes, absolutely. I think that will help movements to recruit more. The more the financial crisis is hitting, the more the reason is clear and more valid why we need this change. So there is a silver lining here. Movements can work on more recruitment. They can work on more mobilization. The only advice I will have is just to continue the fight. And all the small resistance matters, and all the small acts of resistance will lead to bigger blocks than the change we aspire to achieve.
All right.
I think on top of that, I would say there are a lot of ways for people to continue a movement. Even I would say, even with this pandemic, I think the movement in Hong Kong would also kind of like quiet down for a bit after the district council election in November. So it is the time for people to study more and like try to focus more on like local issues and really understand more about international politics and local politics. And then moving forward, now we're seeing the legislative council election coming up in around September. It is time for us to think about how we're going to strategize our protests, our movements to and bring that to the system itself. And I think there are a lot of ways that people can have a in movement on certain levels. There are, for example, in Hong Kong, in our movement, people basically chip in, in their own expertise. There are people like designers. They would be contributing to the movement using their talents by creating more promotional pictures on Instagram, Facebook, or whatsoever, creating leaflets to distribute outside, on the streets. There are people who are, better in, physical activity, I guess, and they would be, more than willing to stand on the front line. And there are all sort of people, they are contributing to this movement using their own expertise. So I think there are always a way for people to contribute to a movement.
Right.
Going back to what I mentioned before during the panel is that, be water. That's one of the things that, Hong Kong protesters always tell people is that we have to adapt with the environment, the atmosphere, and then make sure every action is make sure everything is as flexible as possible. So yeah.
That's be water. That's great advice from Bruce Lee and from Francis Hui. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Rania, very much. I'm afraid we have run out of time for questions, but you can stay engaged with us and you can try and reach out to us through Twitter. We'll try and answer more questions if we can. You can reach Rania at Rania Aziz 19. You can reach Francis at Hui_Wingting, WINGTING, and you can reach me at Ghosh World. Thank you so very much for joining us at this session. I hope you got something from it. Rania and Francis, thank you once again.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.